the process of construction starts with the cutting down of trees, obviously. So it starts a long time before the ship's actually even ordered. So the type of wood and like cuts and stuff for ships, including the Victory. Because one thing, the construction of HMS Victory wasn't very well documented, and so this will mainly just be a guide to construction of Royal Navy ships around the time of HMS Victory. So yeah, so the wood cut for ships wasn't just random wood. It was actually
No,
really
no.
specific.
It was
It was
yes.
really specific. So for example, uh, a lot of the parts of a lot of the ship would have been made of oak, but
And pine.
yeah, pine was used and elm was used for like kills and stuff.
Elm was usually used for keels and pumps as it has very rot resistant. Yes.
Yeah, and they shipwrights wanted as little joints in the ship as possible because the more joints, the more weak points. Even though some joints were extremely strong, and we'll get onto that a bit later, they still had.
Another point, because we talked about the growing wood. Usually, trees would be grown tree-bent so you could make planks easier.
So an example, the term bow on a ship actually comes from because they used the bow of a tree for the ship, that part of the ship, so they kind of just called it the bow. And so that's an example. Um, but yeah, like I said before, the wooden warship construction took place over, if properly managed, it took place over many generations, and timbers for a ship would be cut like many years before the warship was even ordered. So yeah, elm, like I said, was favoured for kills because it grew very straight and was also quite rot resistant. That's what HMS Victory used for a kill, elm. And then New England pine was used for the lower masts, which would have ran through the decks and stuff. And the upper masts and yards were used for fir was used and spruce due to its flexibility. Because with the masts, they did tend to move about and stuff, and they wanted that.
Do you
And
also know why exactly they also use New England pine?
why?
Because New England pine is a lighter type of pine. Because there is always a little problem with ships. This counts, doesn't matter how big or small the ship is. When you have a mast, something that big, if not in use, not actively being tensioned, it will damage the keel. But if you're laying still for a while, you want a lighter type of wood that is very resilient and has the flexibility to serve as a mast, which is also why they use pine
Yeah.
instead of oak,
All right.
because oak is heavy.
So yeah, as you can see in the image, there it kind of shows how the trees were cut and what part of the tree were used for different parts of the ship. So this is an example of an oak tree, um, and you can kind of see, yeah. So 6,000 trees later for HMS Victory. All of the once 6,000 trees, which is like a lot, had been cut down, they couldn't just instantly use the timber, and so this was why it took many generations. Um, so they had to store the timber in timber sheds, and they had to let the timber season for quite a few years because if they didn't,
3 years, 3 to 4 years.
yeah,
Max, that's the best for timber working.
if they didn't, it could rot or rot much quicker or crack, and like all
Actually,
sorts
yeah,
of
no, the
bad things.
cracking. It doesn't rot quicker, it just cracks easier and snaps. This is
Yeah.
something I've learned in years of carpentry.
So yeah, they would be stored in timber sheds, and the timber sheds in the picture are actually the timber sheds that would have been used for HMS Victory because they do still exist in Chatham Dockyard. Um, so the masts of HMS Victory would have been stored in the mast pond, but they would have had exact same outcome. It would have just been seasoned there. But the timber sheds, if you think about it, because loads and loads of timber was stored in there, and it would have been all used for the construction of ships, even like years into the future. And so, if a raid was to happen, which one did actually happen on Chatham around 100 years before Victory was built, um, if a raid happened and the timber sheds were targeted, it would have been very devastating for that dockyard because they would have just had to completely restart and they wouldn't have been able to build ships for quite a while later. But luckily, the Dutch raid on the Medway, um,
Sorry.
they didn't actually get the timber sheds, and they've mainly just targeted the ships which are already standing. But yeah, so now that all the timber was cut, the ship could be planned or ordered. So HMS Victory was ordered on the 14th of July 1758 and it would be built at Chatham Dockyard in Kent. The person who designed it was Thomas Slade, who was actually quite a known shipbuilder, or not shipbuilder, but ship designer back in those days. So when the ship was ordered, a full-scale drawing of its outlines would have been drawn in chalk in the mould loft. Again, the mould loft shown in the picture is the one that was used for HMS Victory because it still exists at Chatham Dockyard. If it isn't obvious, Chatham Dockyard is a museum now. It is quite a good museum, and one of the reasons why I've been around it, and it's one of the reasons why I like shipbuilding and stuff. Um, but a lot of the time, if it was a smaller piece of timber, they could actually take it up to the mould loft and kind of create the curve that was needed, rather than just using a template and like taking it down to a workshop. But because the mould loft wasn't actually a workshop, this could only be done on small timber. It had if it was a large piece of timber, then they had to create a template. Um, yeah. So
Can I ask you something?
sorry.
Can I ask you something?
Right.
Why was it called the mold loft?
I did actually think that myself. I'm not too sure. I'll have to search it up later. But yeah, I'm not
Alright,
entirely sure. Maybe
you may
it
continue.
might have something to do with the fact that um, it helped them kind of mold the timber, into the shape that it needed to be. But yeah, I'm
Alright,
not.
that seems pretty reasonable. You may continue.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. So once the ship had been ordered, planned, and drawn out in the mold loft, they would actually start the construction. So construction of a warship back in the mid 18th century could either be done. It was mostly done on a slipway, like it is nowadays, but it could also be done in a dry dock. And
Of the builder.
HMS Victory was built in a dry dock. This one on the right,
Andre!
this one on the right, which the blue destroyer is in currently, is where HMS Victory was built. It's yeah. So one of the first things, or the first thing that would have been done as part of the construction was the keel. So the keel would have been placed in the very bottom of the dry dock, as it was pretty much the backbone of the ship, and pretty much everything would have been built off of it, like all the frame and everything. And
Alright, I want to correct the mistake you made.
yes,
The term for what you described is called laying the keel. So what you meant to say is they would have first laid the keel, not laid the keel.
yeah, right.
That is a minor mistake, but a mistake nonetheless.
Um,
You may continue.
so the keel would then have another layer of elm placed on top of it, and this would have been called. Now, I've heard multiple things. I'm not entirely sure, but I've heard it be called deadwood before, and I've also heard it be called the keelson. Here it's called the hog, but that's just another term for the deadwood. But you can kind of see it on top of the keel here. Um, but off of this piece of elm would have been the frame, and it kind of looked like a rib cage. So it kind of looked like the rib cage of the ship. But ribbons would have been attached to this frame, um, and they kind of would have kept it in place so that none of the frame like fell apart or anything like that. Um, the ribbons were usually made of like fir or another non-oak wood, and the frame would have been made out of oak. But these ribbons were eventually removed later on in construction, as they weren't a permanent feature of the actual ship. But for these like early parts of the construction, um, the ship
Oh dear
would
God.
have been built in a lot of the ships. It's not known for victory, but a lot of the ships would have been built in sections, especially the big ships, and they would have been joined together by a scarf joint, like at the keel. They would have been joined together by a scarf joint, and this is where two ends of the timber cut to kind of make these almost like wedges, and then they slide together and are held together by
Fred,
tree nails. Yeah,
you just called it a frame, but what you were talking about exactly were the you were talking about a frame, yes,
yeah.
but you pointed towards the ribs and referred to it as a frame. It was that intentional or just not intentional?
Well, I was kind of like saying it looked like the frame looked a bit like a rib cage, but
Yes, no, but those things that you're currently pointing at is also called the ribs of a ship. They're called ribs.
yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah,
My question to you is, will you call them frame if that was intentional?
yeah.
All right, then I retract any statement I have said.
Right. So the during scarfing, um, um, the thing that would have held them together, because if they weren't held together by anything, it's quite obvious that they just would have slid apart. And so they were held together. They were held together by something called tree nails, and basically they're just nails made out of wood. So that's what kind of where the tree nail comes from. But the reason why they wouldn't have used, because a lot of nails back then were iron, they wouldn't have used iron because obviously in water it rusts, but it also can cause, especially iron, can cause a lot of damage to the wood around it because it can cause it to rot and stuff. So yeah, when the scar film was slid together, they were held together by tree nails, and after this, the frame and the keel was all done, and so they would start working on the uh, bow and stern posts, and these would be connected. So this is, you can kind of see them here. They would be connected, and they would um, continue the keel upwards. Um, Shipwrights really wanted a single piece of timber for both posts, but for ships, especially like Victory, that was almost impossible because you don't really have trees that were that tall, like in England, because most would have come from England, but and you wouldn't have had trees that tall, and so they had to use joints, but they wanted as few joints as possible, and by this point, most of the construction would take place like way higher than any man could reach, because Victory was a very big ship. It was first rate, so they would have to use a type of crane called a shear, and these were basically just like A-frame cranes that were just made out of like spare timber, and they would just use a series of like block and tackles to like um, make it much easier to lift the thing that they needed to lift, which could sometimes weigh a lot. And they would usually be operated by men, but sometimes um, they did use animals and stuff. And so once the bow and stern posts were placed, the stern frame would be built. It usually was built on the floor, and then a shear would raise it into place on the stern, and that would kind of um, like create the main shape of the ship, and you would really start to see the ship come to shape. And in between all of this, because you can kind of see how there's like gaps in between the frame and everything, and so they would start to place like temporary frames and filling frames to make sure that they don't like fall over or warp or anything like that. It was more of just a security feature, but it is better than to be like safe than sorry. So once all of the frames had been placed, they would start working to make the ship look more like a ship rather than just a frame of a ship. And by doing this, they would put, so on the interior they would install stuff like mast steps, which were used to keep the masts in place, and they would also install deck beams which ran along the frames so that the deck planking could be put in and supported. Um, and knees were also installed. You can kind of see them here, but what a knee was is it basically supported the bulkhead or wall of the ship, and so it would, if there was any forces, mainly from the cannon, it would like mitigate the forces into the walls of the ship, which were much sturdier. So then there would be much less damage on the decks and stuff. Um, the hull would also be planked at this stage, and so you would really start to see um, the ship become a ship. Um, this at this point also a lot of the like before this point, a lot of the timber would have been like the bends in the timber would have been kind of naturally bent. Some of the timber for the frame, especially, would have obviously been artificially bent. But after this point, most timber was artificially bent, especially that for the planking of the hull. And so um, they would use a process called steam bending, and that pretty much meant submerging a plank into water and then putting it into a really hot box which was filled with
You
steam.
know, there is an alternative.
Sorry.
There is an alternative which is also commonly used. You could soak it for a few days in water and then bend it and then you dry it with weights upon it. That is also a commonly used method by the time steam was at the heart, but it was done.
Um. Yeah. But once the plank was really hot, that it would be malleable, like slightly, and then they'd be able to bend it. Sometimes, if it was a really like big bend, they would have to go over um, and like keep heating it up and multiple times.
Yes.
But
To be
um,
exact, it stays malleable for 3 exact minutes.
yeah. Um, but after all of this, like all these like mast posts and stuff like, or not mast posts, but yeah, after all like the deck planking and stuff like that was done, um, other major parts of the ship would be mounted. So this includes stuff like the capstans and the pumps of the ship, and also some smaller mast steps would be fitted. So and then at this point, the ribbons would be removed because by this point, like all of the whole planking had been placed, and so the frame was pretty sturdy. And like I mentioned before, like when I was going over the scarfing joints, tree nails were one of the main things that held all of this together. So of course on the scarfing joints they held it together, but tree nails were actually used all over the ship. And like I said before, it's because the other alternative was at this point the other alternative was iron nails, and that wouldn't have
Steel.
been very good for the wood around it, especially if it was submerged in water a lot. Copper nails were starting to become a thing, like after the Victory was built, but in like later refits they would have been used. But by this point it was mainly just iron that could be used. Um, so by this point, um, they'll start like doing all the deck planking, and every every major part of the ship that was really structural would have been completed. One of the last things that they would do, not the last, but one of the last, was they'd cut out the gun ports in the whole of the ship. Sometimes there would kind of be a gap or a space left for the gun port, but in other cases it was just a case of chiseling through the hole and creating around a nice square for the guns. Um, yeah, so that's a mast step, kind of. That's like on a model. I couldn't. I tried to find a better picture of a mast step, but I really couldn't. But this is like a little model of a mast step, and that's a tree nail in use. So yeah, the gun ports would then be cut out. These are the gun ports on HMS Victory, by the way, like right now. And then after that had been done, pretty much the final step would be caulking, and so caulking was quite a long process, which would eventually waterproof the ship. And so all the seams and cracks in between the planks would be filled with oakum, and oakum was pretty much fibres of an old rope. And then
Yes,
on
it was a disassembled rope made specifically a hone rope. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but yeah,
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 and
you
once
like that.
all the seams had been filled with oakum, they would then be coated with tar, which eventually would fully waterproof the ship. On this picture here of the deck of HMS Victory, you can kind of see in between each of the planks there's like a black like substance. That would be where it had been caulked and waterproofed. But after all of that, they would fill the very bottom of the ship with a small amount of ballast, and they would then launch the ship. Um, the ship in the picture is not HMS Victory, but it's very similar to it. It is a first rate. Um, and it shows the ship being launched at a slipway, but HMS Victory would have been launched at a dry dock, so they would have just filled the dry dock, and then they would have like flooded it, and then they would have floated the ship out. So it wouldn't have been as good of a launch because, like, in like most ship launches, you see they like crash into the water and everything. But for HMS Victory, it was just they would have just been floated out. But
As we are taking the pause, I would like to point out a small mistake, which it's not your mistake. It's a mistake of the painter of this video, of the video picture, but a lot of people may not know. You see the yellow color for the ship, which is actually a color that they got in the 50s, would be most commonly used for the ships. It was also commonly misseen as yellow, but what would actually used for Royal Navy ships would be a salmon-ish pink.
yeah,
And a lot of people mistake it for a yellow, like because you do have a yellow, yes, but it's still pinkish yellow.
yeah,
It's just a little detail that a lot of people get wrong, and I would have like to point out to people.
so once the ship had been launched, the construction was still nowhere near finished. So they would have had to fit out the ship. So they would have put in all the masts and stuff, and which would the masts would just pretty much fit right in. They wouldn't have had to put too much work into them. It wouldn't have been very hard. The main part of the masts, like the main problem with the masts, would be actually getting them high enough that they could then fit into the ship. But they were just been using cranes and stuff. But I'm just going to go over a few statistics about what the Victory actually needed. So the Victory required 27 miles of rope, and so it actually would have come from um, not even 200 meters away from the dry dock. It was built in. The ropery at Chatham, which still exists, would have made pretty much all of the rope um, for HMS Victory, and 27 miles rope. So the ropery in this image, you can kind of tell, but the ropery is a quarter of a mile long. So that's a lot of work that would have had to be put in to. So this ropery would have been very busy. But yeah, it's very interesting. They still make rope to this day. But and you can go and watch it even. But yeah, they required 27 miles of rope for all the rigging, all the anchors and stuff like that. It also required around 6,510 yards of sail, which would have all come from the sail loft at Chatham, which again still exists to this day. You can't really go in it and see the sails being made because I don't think they really do anymore. But the building still exists, And sales back in these days, especially on a big warship like HMS Victory, were very complex because you would need loads of different types of sails, and they would be very big as well. And so, yeah, the HMS Victory also had space for 104 guns, and that's why it's a first rate. A first rate is any ship with over 100 guns. Altogether, these guns would have weighed around 206 tons. These ones wouldn't have been made in a dockyard though. They would have come from places like the Royal Brass Foundry in Woolwich. I mean, they might not have. I don't really know where they came from because it's not really documented. But yeah, and for HMS Victory, um, she was built for the 7 Years' War, which was taking place at that time. But when she was launched, uh, the war ended. Like, it was quite unfortunate. And so because of this, she was left to sit in dry dock for a long time on the stocks. And while this may seem like a bad thing, it wasn't actually, because it allowed. So like at the very beginning, we talked about the seasoning of all the timbers after they'd been cut. This is kind of the same process. It allowed the ship to kind of just set, and any like cracks or anything that would have happened at sea would then have taken place in the dry dock right next to all these shipwrights who could then go and fix it. But yeah, so because of that, by the time she was released into sea service, she was as good as she could have been. And that's one of the reasons why she actually lasted for such a long time. I mean, she is obviously still in commission now, and she's the oldest commissioned warship. But she lasted up until obviously she fought in the
Uh-huh.
Battle of Trafalgar.
She's commissioned.
Yeah, um, yeah. So that will be the end of this part one now. There will be a part two soon. I'm currently writing my script for it. But yeah. Thank you for watching.